It looks obvious from the outside. They know it's a bad decision. They've said it themselves. And yet, they still choose it. Not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly. At first, it doesn't make sense. But then you start to notice something. It does make sense, just not in the way you expected. We assume people act rationally. That if someone understands something, they'll act accordingly. If they know better, they'll do better. That's the quiet rule behind everything. Advice, arguments, expectations, it's built into how we judge behavior, how we explain it, how we predict what someone will do next. But it keeps breaking. People stay where they're unhappy. They defend things that hurt them. They reject solutions that would actually help. They repeat decisions they already know don't work, and when that happens, we call it irrational. But what if that's the mistake? What if the model itself is wrong? What if we're measuring behavior against the wrong system? What if they're not being irrational at all? What if they're being perfectly consistent? Take something simple. Someone stays in a situation that clearly isn't working. From the outside, it's obvious. They should leave. There's no ambiguity. The outcome is predictable. The pattern is clear. They know it too. They've thought about it. They've explained it. They've said it out loud, and still, they stay. That's where it usually stops. We assume fear, confusion, indecision. We assume something is blocking them. But there's something quieter happening. Something that doesn't show up in the explanation. Something that isn't visible unless you stop looking at the outcome and start looking at the pattern. Staying might not be the failure. It might be the requirement. Because leaving would mean something else, something harder to face. Leaving might mean, I was wrong. I stayed too long. I misread everything. I trusted something I shouldn't have. And that doesn't just change the situation, it rewrites the past. It changes the meaning of everything that came before, every decision, every justification, every moment that felt certain. It forces a different story, a version where the decisions weren't what they seemed, a version where the confidence wasn't accurate, a version where the identity built around those decisions doesn't hold. And that's difficult to carry. So staying protects something, not the situation, not the outcome, the identity built around it. Over time, small interpretations repeat, quietly, almost unnoticed. I'm the kind of person who doesn't give up. I stay loyal. I don't walk away. I commit. I endure. At first, those feel like values, something chosen, something intentional. Then they become patterns, repeated in different situations, applied automatically, and eventually, they become identity. Now the decision isn't just a decision anymore. It's connected to something larger, something more stable. Leaving doesn't just solve a problem. It contradicts who they believe they are. And that's where the shift happens. The choice changes, quietly, almost invisibly. It's no longer, what makes the most sense? It becomes, what keeps me consistent with myself? And suddenly, the irrational choice starts to look different. It's no longer about outcome, it's about alignment. This doesn't just happen in obvious situations. It shows up in smaller ways, more subtle ways. Someone refuses to admit they were wrong, even when the evidence is clear. Even when the correction is simple. Not because they don't understand, but because understanding would require a shift. I'm someone who's right. Admitting otherwise doesn't just change. Because if that changes, what else changes with it? What else becomes uncertain? What else no longer holds? What else has to be reevaluated? That's where the assumption breaks. People don't act based on logic alone. Comey's. After. Explanations are often built afterward, clean, structured, reasonable. They sound right, they feel complete. But the decision was already made, quietly, earlier, sometimes instantly. sometimes before the reasoning even forms. The explanation isn't the cause, it's the justification. At first, that feels uncomfortable, because it changes how you see everything. Arguments stop being about facts. Decisions stop being about outcomes. Disagreements stop being about truth. They become about preservation. Think about it again. Someone keeps making the same mistake. You explain it clearly. You show them the pattern. You point to the outcome. They agree completely, and then nothing changes. That's the moment where rationality should take over, where awareness should lead to correction. But it doesn't, because agreement isn't enough. Agreement feels like progress. It feels like movement. But it isn't, because agreement doesn't shift identity. And without that shift, behavior repeats. Not because they don't know, but because knowing isn't the deciding factor. Repetition stabilizes identity. Each time the behavior happens again, it reinforces the interpretation. This is just how I am. This is what I do. This is how I handle things. This is who I've always been. And eventually, it stops feeling like a choice at all. It starts to feel inevitable, expected, normal. And once something feels normal, it becomes harder to question, even when something doesn't line up, even when the outcome keeps repeating, even when the contradiction is still there. That's where the contradiction sits, quiet, unresolved, still present, but no longer disruptive. Integrated. That's where it becomes invisible. Because from the inside, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels consistent. And consistency is powerful, more powerful than logic, more powerful than outcomes. Because consistency creates stability, and stability feels safe, even when that stability comes at a cost. What looks irrational from the outside is often perfectly logical from the inside. And that changes the question completely. Instead of asking, why would they do that? You start asking, what does this protect? Because behavior isn't random. It's structured. Not around outcomes, but around identity preservation. Someone stays because they're loyal. Someone argues because they're right. Someone avoids change because they're stable. Someone overworks because they're dependable. Someone apologizes because they're agreeable. Someone stays silent because they're careful. Each action reinforces something, even when it costs them. And the cost doesn't always stop it. Sometimes the cost strengthens it. Because now the identity has proof. See, I endured this. See, I stayed. See, I didn't break. See, I handled it. The cost becomes evidence. And once the identity is reinforced like that, it becomes harder to let go. Because letting go would mean the cost meant nothing. That the effort didn't confirm anything. That the sacrifice didn't define anything. And that's harder than the behavior itself. It would mean reinterpreting everything. Not just the present, but the past. That's why advice often fails. Because advice targets the action. But the action isn't the root. The identity is. And identity doesn't shift easily. It resists correction. It absorbs contradiction. It explains things away. It reinterprets evidence to stay intact. Even clear evidence. Even repeated outcomes. Even patterns that don't change. So the behavior continues. Not because it makes sense, but because it fits. And over time something else happens. The pattern stops feeling like something they're doing, and starts feeling like something they are. I'm just like this. This is how I've always been. This is what people expect from me. This is what I'm known for. And once it reaches that point, it becomes harder to even imagine a different version. Not because it's impossible, even if it makes more sense, even if it would change the outcome, even if it would solve the problem. People don't just choose what's logical. It's hard to break, even when it should be, even when they know, even when it costs them. And that's the part most people miss. They're not confused. They're consistent. It didn't feel wrong.